The concept of grouping layers together, or in After Effects language, pre-composing the layers, is very important. Sometimes you want to group the layers together in order to simplify your timeline, and sometimes you group them so you can apply a couple of keyframes to the entire group, and those keyframes will affect every single layer in the group. As I mentioned, grouping layers in After Effects is called pre-composing or pre-comping, and the reason for that is that when you group the layers together, you then place them inside a different composition, and the initial group becomes a pre-composition. Let's have a look at how it's done. In this example, we've got this robot arm, as you can see here. We've animated this in the previous tutorials. And additionally, I just created some solids in the background. I'm just going to click and drag this around so you can see the animation. This is what we created in the previous tutorials. And what I want to do now is initially just make a bit more space for the timeline. You can see I have all these extra layers that I don't really want. And what I'll do is take all these layers that make the robot arm and then group them together. And you do that simply by holding down Shift and selecting the layers that you want to include in this group. And you either press Command, Shift, and C. This is a useful shortcut you want to remember, Command, Shift, C. Or you can right-click on the selection, and then you go right down towards the bottom, it says Pre-compose. Or you can come up to the Layer menu here, and right at the bottom of that list is also the same option, Pre-compose. But I'd recommend memorizing this shortcut because you'll be using this quite a lot. So I'm going to click. It then asks me what I want to call this composition. So I'm going to go and call this Robot Solo. And I'll just go and press OK. What happens now is if I make a bit more space from my composition panel, what After Effects does when I do that is to create a new composition, and it calls it Robot Solo, like I told it to. And it places all the layers that made that robot arm into this composition, and it then places the composition inside my current composition, hence the term pre-composition. Now this is really helpful, because I can select the layer now, the Robot Solo layer, and then I can drag this around and do whatever. I can scale this, rotate this, and do whatever I want with this. And as I'm doing all of that, it's going to animate the same layers as it did before inside of this layer. So have a look. So the same animation remains. But as it's happening, let's say for example I wanted this to fade in, I can select this and then press T. I now have the opacity for the entire group. I can then keyframe the opacity at 0% and then go forward and then increase this to 100%. And as the animation is happening, I'm going to fade in all of those layers at the same time. And if I wanted to change anything about this animation, the actual robot animation, all I would need to do would be to go and double click anywhere on this layer, and that takes me into the pre-comp where I only have the layers of the robot. Let's say for example I wanted this animation to be a little bit slower, so I can select all the layers, Command A, then I press the letter U to see the keyframes. And then I'm going to make a bit more space for the timeline. And I'll select all the keyframes like that. And if you remember from the previous tutorials, you can hold down Alt and then click on the last keyframe and then drag this, and this will row the keyframes across time. And now I've just slowed down the whole animation, so it's happening much slower now. And the great thing about this is that if I switch back to my previous composition, which is the robot arm, and if I then go back and play it, you see that this will also happen slower than it was before. So this shows us that the two compositions will always remain linked. If I make a change to anything inside the Robot Solo here, let's say for example I go and turn the base off, if I scroll down, turn the base layer off, and if I switch back to the previous comp, the base will disappear here as well. So that's such a powerful tool at your disposal. Let me show you a different example here. If I go and maybe turn the base on again, and then we have another comp here that I brought in. It's the Science Lab comp. I'm going to open this up. It's just a simple illustration here. Let me just press Shift/. And if I take my Robot Solo and then drag it from here into this composition, and if I zoom out, I can now position this anywhere I like, or I can actually scale this as well. So let me press S, and then I'll scale this down a little bit. And then I'll position this, let's say, here. And I'll place this between the scientist and the foreground, so it's behind the scientist. And if I play it now, you'll see that the animation happens as if it's part of this scene. And let's say now I wanted this entire composition, so the composition with the scientist and the lab, plus the robot arm, to fade in. Well, that's easy. I can now select all of these layers, including my pre-comp here, and then I create one more pre-comp by pressing Command, Shift and C. And then I can go and rename this. I can call this Lab with Robot. And if I hit OK, that's going to now create a new composition here. It will call it Lab with Robot, and it places that composition inside my current composition. And then I can just go and edit the opacity of this. If I go back to the beginning, just go to Transform, Keyframe Opacity at 0%, and then go forward, and then increase this to 100%, and then it will fade the entire scene in. And let's say around about there, I want it to fade back out. I can select these two keyframes, then copy and paste, and then finally, I can time reverse these keyframes so that the second and the third keyframes are the same, and the first and the fourth keyframes are the same. So here we go. By using pre-comps, you can combine different compositions together, as well as simplifying your timelines.